Good evening, people. Titus here for another Unreal Engine tutorial, and in this video we'll cover animation blueprints. This will be a beginner tutorial that will cover importing animations and creating the logic to drive those animation states through a blueprint. Let's not waste any time and jump right into it. Alright, starting off we're going to create some folders. First one's going to be _anim, and second one is going to be _blueprints. I'm going to go into our animation folder, and I'm going to import my FBX file, and then I'm going to make sure I have import animations checked. Hit import all, and that should bring my skeleton, mesh, and all the animations tied to that armature. You can get your animation data from Mixamo, or you can create it yourself custom in Blender or some other 3D modeling software. Alright, we have our information in. I'm going to go to the blueprints folder, and then I'm going to right click, create a new blueprint class. I'm going to do of type character, call it BP_player, and double click, open that up. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into the third person template. I'm going to open up the third person character as well, because I want to steal the camera boom or the spring arm and the camera. I can just copy that, and then I can right click, paste, and I'll bring that in over here. I can highlight the mesh component. On the right hand side there is a skeletal mesh section. I can find my mesh that I got from Mixamo. You can see it doesn't quite bring in right, so I'm going to go to front view, and then I'm just going to drag him down a bit, and that looks correct. Alright, now I need controls, so if I go to the event graph, you can see it's basically blank. To save some time, I'm just going to use the control scheme from the third person. So I can copy that and just paste that in here. And if I compile and save, that should be good to go. The other thing I'm going to do too is under the character movement component, I am going to have a basically a sprint. So I'm going to slow down my max walk speed to like 140, and then I'll do crouch to 50. Now if we go to the project settings, under maps and modes, you can expand out the selected game mode, change the default pawn class from the template to the blueprint you just created. Now if I play the game, I have my Mixamo character, but the animations are not working, so we got to set those up. I also have no way to sprint yet, so let's go ahead and fix that. In the event graph, I can just find an empty space, do keyboard left shift, and then I can drag out my character movement and get a reference, and it's set max walk speed. I can press Control D to duplicate that, hook up the character movement reference, and then I'll put the pressed into one, released in the other, and it's as simple as just setting one to be a higher value and the other one to be my starting value. Now if I compile and play, I can actually move around. If I hold shift, I'll move quicker. Easy enough. Let's go ahead and set up the animation states. So the way Unreal Engine works is it uses what's called an animation blueprint to drive state machines. And it's pretty simple. You can just right click under the animation section. We can do animation blueprint. You choose the skeleton or the armature that has all your animation data. In my case, it's the worker skeleton. I'll create that, call it ABP_worker, and then I can double click to open it up. This looks very familiar. It's another event graph. You simply right click, create a state machine. You can click into it to name it. We'll call it locomotion. Hook that in there. Now you can double click into locomotion to actually open the event graph there. And in the bottom right corner, there is an asset browser, and it has all the animations that are tied to that armature. So again, this would be something you downloaded from Mixamo, or if you created them from your 3D modeling software, whatever you rigged it to, basically. So we just need to drag all of these animations into the graph. So the first one looks like an idle, so I'll drag that. I'm going to rename it to just idle. And this one's a jump. I'll rename that to jump. This is a run. Call it just run. And this one's the walk. So call it walk. I'm going to press Shift S to align that. Alright, so now we need to create the basically the logic here for the state machine. So on enter, we should probably just go straight into idle. That makes sense. From idle, we should be able to go into walk, and then from walk, we should be able to go into run. Now we need to set up these conditions. To handle swapping between these animation states, I think I can do this with two variables. I think a Boolean to check if the character is in the air, and then a float value to check the velocity or the speed. And that should be enough to get me everywhere where I need with just this simple setup. If you have a more complex setup, you might need more variables. So coming down to the variable section, I'm going to add a is airborne question mark, and then I'm going to add a speed. The speed is going to be a float, while the airborne is going to be a Boolean, basically a yes or a no. I can go into the first transition, so from idle to walk. I want to make sure that the character is not in the air, so I can come off a not Boolean. But I also want to make sure that the speed is greater than 0. And at the same time, I should probably also check to make sure that the speed is less than n equal to, like, say, 150. Now you may be asking, well, why not use 140? If we go back to character movement, I did 140 for the max walk speed. I like to give myself a little bit of a buffer, because sometimes, you know, depending on what's in the game or how you're moving, if you're right on that threshold, you might trigger it, and you might look a little, you might get some jagged transitions. So I give myself just a little, 10 unit float buffer, basically. Then I can drag into off one of the pins and go into an AND Boolean. And you notice I only have 2 pins, so I can just hit the plus sign to add a third pin, hook these up as so, and then that's my first check done. I can use the top to actually navigate between my event graph or the back arrow. So I'm going to click on locomotion. So I completed this one, now I need to go in the next one. So for walk to run, it's going to be more of the same. I want to make sure the character is not in the air. And then I want to make sure that the speed is above, let's say 150, so greater than 150. And I can drag off this, do an AND Boolean, hook up the 2 checks, and then that one is done as well. Go back to locomotion. Now I need to be able to come back from run all the way back to idle, so we can drag execution pins over to this direction. And now we need to set up the conditions. So we can do this one. Obviously I want to make sure I'm not in the air, so come off into a not Boolean. And then the speed, I want to make sure is less than 150. And then come into an AND Boolean, like so. And then for the walk to idle, that's going to be, again, make sure the character is not in the air, and then make sure the speed is less than, or actually let's make sure the speed is equal to 0. And then we can come into an AND Boolean, hook these 2 up, and that covers all the conditions there. Now for my jump, I want to be able to jump if I'm standing still, walking, and running. So I can hook up conditions there, like so. And then just to control this, make it simple, I can just pop in airborne is true. And I think that's going to be the same for all three of these. Just make sure that the character is in the air and then play that animation. But I don't want to stay in the jumping animation, I want a way to come back. So I'm going to drag back to each state. And we'll start with the jump to run. So I want to make sure airborne is then set to false. But I also want to make sure that the speed is greater than 150. So make sure there's movement. Come into an and boolean, hook up the pins, and that's pretty easy. And then the next one, coming from jump to walk. So that one is going to be make sure airborne is false. And then make sure speed is greater than 0, but also less than 150. Less equal than 150. And then I can do an and boolean, add a pin, and then that completes the jump to walk. And then the jump to idle, that's just going to be the airborne is false, and the speed is equal to 0. Come into an and boolean, hook these up here, and now if I did this right and compile, we should go into our animation state. It looks a little bit better. Now this still isn't going to work because we're missing one very important piece of information. So if I go back to the player and I go into the mesh component, there's an animation mode and an anim class. It's already set for Blueprint, which is good. The animation class we would set to our animation blueprint worker. And like that, we see the idle animation, but it's still not going to work. So if we play this, we'll notice I'm not switching animations, right? And that kind of makes sense. In our blueprint, we have all these variables, but we're not driving the logic behind them. So how do you know airborne is true or false? And how do you know the value of speed? There's usually an event graph in your blueprint, so just go into that. And this is where you have to actually set up the magic, I guess, the logic. For the try get pawn owner, we can just simply drag in get movement component, and the movement component is a reference to the character movement here. So then I can come off of that and do a get velocity, and then from the velocity I can get the vector length, and the vector length is of course speed. So we can basically plug that into a speed variable. And then same thing with the movement component. There's a wonderful function off the movement component called is falling. It's great. So we can actually just drag off this and do is falling, and that'll check if the mesh is actually in the air. So then you can do is airborne, do set, and just plug this in, and that'll control that very easily for you. And then we can just hold shift, click on these execution pins, compile, hook them up, and that completes our event graph and our state machine for the animation blueprint. So now we can just save, test out our logic. We're walking along and we run into another issue. So this issue is going to be our animation looping. If you go into the locomotion, we want to loop some of these animations. Not all of them, just the idle, walk, and the run, right? Because we don't want to loop the jump animation. So we can go into idle, click on the actual animation. There's a loop animation checkbox. Just click that and repeat that for each of the various animations. And then we can compile and save. And now, when we play our state, our character continues to move as we expect. If I go into the run state, he runs. If I go into a falling or a jump state, he jumps. Alright, good people, we'll cut it here, but I hope you found some informative value in this topic that you can take into your own projects. But as always, thanks for watching, consider subscribing, and see you on the next one.